Okay, everybody, welcome. So what we're going to do is actually not have set discussions from the front because we've only got an hour. I'll throw a few questions out here. And I've got a few questions I'd like to see answered, but we'll see how it comes out. Our panel is a mixture of academics, entrepreneurs, people living the, well, I was going to say living the dream, but I'm not sure it is a dream, but living the life anyway of an entrepreneur. We've got Amali de Alwis, CEO of Code First. We've got George Hull, he organises festivals, so he probably doesn't use the phrase CEO. No? What do you use?
I could call myself a promoter.
A promoter, okay. Kevin McCulloch, do you call yourself a CEO? No? Founder, he's a founder, so he was there at the beginning, and so claims all responsibility for everything good and bad. And then we've got Kevin Mole, who's the academic that I mentioned, and he hopefully will have his. He just watches. He watches from the side. He gets paid every month, no matter what happens. So. And I'm your chair, Mark Burbeck. So I guess one of the first things to begin with, anybody, is what do we mean by an entrepreneur? There were some stats in the press earlier in the week talking about a rise in self-employment. So maybe in the definitions of entrepreneur, we can maybe touch on whether there's a distinction between self-employment and entrepreneurialism. But maybe just first, what do we mean by an entrepreneur? George?
I'd argue that an entrepreneur is an individual who has chosen to start their own business or enterprise in order to employ themselves and others to the benefit of the economy and ultimately to their own benefit.
I suppose I'll have to say something here as the academic because we've got lots of definitions of entrepreneurs. So that definition that says an entrepreneur is somebody who's in the process of starting a business, which I think George has just mentioned. That's one definition of an entrepreneur. But quite often we think of entrepreneurs as innovative. We might decide that some businesses are less innovative than others. We also might want entrepreneurs to be in, and I guess that's a fairly contentious thing to say, that your business is not as innovative as another one is. But it also is the case that quite often entrepreneurs are the people who start new industries. There's almost no industry I can think of that didn't start with an entrepreneur starting the business and making that really hard choice of starting something where you almost have to legitimize the product that they were doing. So that's a kind of almost an, I'd hate to use the word Uber entrepreneur, but that's the sort of thing that I mean. So we think of it as people being innovative, but also can we think of more entrepreneurial large businesses as well? So in the academic literature, we sometimes have this thing called corporate entrepreneurship, where large companies are keen to explore new products, new markets for them, and the more that they are proactive, innovative, and risk-taking, the more we think that those large companies can have something called an entrepreneurial orientation. So I guess there's three elements there really about being innovative, being courageous enough to start new industries where large companies essentially fear to tread, and also starting new businesses that might not be as innovative, but are new and create new things in the economy. So that's kind of my 3 or 4 definitions.
Very good, thank you. Amali?
I guess probably just touching on those points, yeah, you've got a lot of sort of overlapping terms, I think. You've got entrepreneurship, you've got startups, you've got private business, entrepreneurs, mobile discos, McDonald's franchises, hairdressers, as well as the Slacks and the Blaze and the Skypes and all of those kind of things. So it's a really general term, which I think we use to kind of, encompass a lot of things. And I think actually the terminology and how we define entrepreneur, for me, is actually a really interesting question, because I think there's a part of it which also carries through that. What's the culture of entrepreneurship like? What is the rhetoric around entrepreneurship that we're actually advocating when we say that we want more people to become entrepreneurs?
Okay. Kevin?
You're right, there are lots of overlapping terms. It's quite confusing, but I think for the purposes of this today, I personally think that the focus on innovation and growth is the most useful. rather than the size of the company or the ownership of the company. So I think something like, Kevin's put me right if I've got these stats wrong, but I think something like 15% of the UK workforce and 60% of UK businesses are sole traders. They're builders, they're taxi drivers, things like that. And I think a lot of those people are sole traders out of necessity. Their jobs have been outsourced, if you like. So I don't think some of those people won't particularly see themselves as entrepreneurs or be happy about the situation they're in. So I think I don't know whose distinction this is, but one distinction I've heard is the necessity entrepreneurs and the opportunity entrepreneurs. And I think it's the opportunity entrepreneurs, whether they are the small startup at the roundabout or whether it's, I think what Google have done is quite interesting. They've split their company into the bit of the company that makes money, the business as usual company, and then the other bits of the company that they're trying to create new industries. So I think that's obviously a huge company. So I think that's the kind of way I look at entrepreneurs.
So maybe we could have a quick show of hands, actually. So who would agree that, say, a hairdresser is an entrepreneur? Oh, not many. Not many.
Yeah.
Oh, that's true. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So who said that? Did you say that?
I think it's about maybe challenging what's already happening. So not challenging the status quo, but being able to challenge what's kind of already happening within society and creating something so it's new, but it's about challenging as well. So if you're a hairdresser that's doing something that's different and maybe, I don't know, creating salons, a franchise model or something different, then that would be very entrepreneurial.
George, you had a slightly different definition.
Perhaps we can draw a distinction based on growth. So an individual who chooses to cut hair or wash windows or whatever for a living and they get paid essentially by the hour, although they're employed directly by the client, may not consider themselves an entrepreneur, whereas a similar individual who's seeking to grow that business and employ people and market and expand might be defined as an entrepreneur a little more accurately, and perhaps that's where you can sort of draw a distinction between the two types of self-employment.
What about this element of courage that Kevin touched on? Were you going to say anything about that?
No, I was just going to say, in my brain, and I think it's all slightly sort of semantic, it's almost easier to think about it as being entrepreneurialism rather than being an entrepreneur, because you can kind of, then you get a sense of, if someone's entrepreneurial, that they're building something, they're growing something, that they're sort of, going beyond just delivering, a service or a product, that there's some sort of ambition there.
Entrepreneurial spirit, people often use that expression.
You can kind of think of people being enterprising, and then if you're enterprising, then you can be enterprising in all sorts of walks of life. You can be enterprising within a local council, I think.
Does anyone know the etymology of the word entrepreneur? It sounds as if it may be French, but
Well, it is,
I don't know.
Because there's no French for entrepreneur. That's
So where does the word come from? What does it mean in etymological
well, I mean,
terms?
I guess
Do we know?
well, entre is between, and so you get this. You get an academic view that's around Kirshner, who says, well, actually, what entrepreneurs do is they take from one area and they move it to another area. So it's almost like somebody who's an arbitrager, who understands that, I guess, if you think of somebody who cooks, who's the guy who used to go down to the West Country and do his cooking, and then he would always grow his vegetables and then take his van to somewhere where there was an enclosed environment so he could put his prices up. So what they've basically done is they've gone, okay, well, I can take this and add value. And I suppose that's another aspect that we should concern ourselves with, is this notion of adding value. Because you can have people who start businesses where they're actually not adding value, because they might be competing with somebody else. Maybe there's I talked to people from the Prince's Youth Trust years ago, and they would talk about car valeters. So these were people starting a business as a car valeter. And they were saying that it was a really bad business to get into, because there were only a few people who would be the people who you would go to to say I can be the car valeter. So you would end up talking to the garages. And then 6 months later, another guy from the Princess Youth would come along, he was in Stourbridge, and talk to the garages and say, well, I can undercut them. So they're almost, in the end, not adding value. But, okay, there's in the audience. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Okay, so any thoughts?
By the very definition, if you undercut somebody else, you are adding value because you're offering consumers more for their money. Just the point. So the profit-loss system sorts this out, that every venture will be weeded out if it runs a loss. It maybe had an idea, but it was a false hypothesis. Of course, there's moments of adjustment cost in a dynamic society, but I agree also with you that a hairdresser who's entered an established market will have to do something different, something new, to tease away others from what they're now receiving. There's an inherent, the survival would require an element of innovation. But also the other added value is that not only for consumers, but the person himself who moves into the valeting is adding and making himself more productive, because that's the choice where he thought he can have a return relative to what he was doing before. Well, it's always comparative where we're going. I want to add one more point, which is interesting. This distinction between entrepreneurs out of necessity and out of opportunity, and that there's a kind of hint perhaps within there that we should feel sorry for those who only are sole traders, or that something should be done about the kind of precarious labor. People are pushed into self-employment and so on. I reject and resist that. And I think there's something false about this. It's a kind of nanny state attitude. I don't think these are people who are making choices relative to other opportunities, and I would laudate this. And this is similar with the Uber drivers who are now kind of starting to be pitied, or even themselves trying to kind of retrospectively redefine their condition as an employment condition, which I think needs to be rejected.
So you're saying there's something positive about people becoming entrepreneurs, but it is the case though that say some years ago when the BBC had a big shakeout and the NHS, a lot of the people that got laid off then became consultants who sort of consulted back to the BBC and the NHS, so they became self-employed.
But is there a difference there between a freelancer and an entrepreneur? Because I mean, for me, there feels instinctively like there is a difference. I mean, a freelancer for me is someone who offers some sort of service, generally speaking, for another company. An entrepreneur is someone who actually owns something, which is either proprietary product, or they offer something where the revenues of the selling of that product kind of come back to them rather than just their service. I know it's a loose term, and I suppose one could argue, I don't know, do you have to have a product? Do you have to have a premises to be an entrepreneur? Is that something?
I think.
Can you be an entrepreneur if you're running around and you don't have an office?
He has fields.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, we don't actually operate our festival in fields, as it happens. Most festivals are operated in fields. Ours was held in a holiday resort in a Butlins, very British institution, in the winter, and this is the only place in England. Perhaps I don't even know if there's anywhere else that exists quite like a Butlins anywhere in the world. But this place can sleep 7,000 people and entertain all of them under a roof all at once for a weekend in one go, which is quite impressive actually. And they all sleep in a bed and they have a shower and a kitchen and a television and all these kinds of things. And what Butlins have got, as an example of what would have been an entrepreneurial project of the 1940s, and it's now like a corporation, is incredible infrastructure. And I think that the infrastructure actually is key to growing businesses, and that's kind of like perhaps that's one thing which marks out an individual freelancer or someone operating in the modern economy who is on a 0 hours contract or not on a contract at all, or working sort of peddling their services and their abilities and their wares for money versus an established business infrastructure which is kind of growing, and I also have leased some warehouses, and again that's premises, and those kinds of things can mark out the kind of the beginnings, the foundations of an established enterprise, all the way up to incredible infrastructure of a Butlins.
Yep.
Yeah, just on the infrastructure thing, I was looking for something to debunk the first opening line of this talk, which was about the vision of entrepreneurs and geeks in their bedroom, because I think that's just history now that doesn't even apply. I think tech startups are all about some kind of infrastructure. Like the new thing is the accelerator. They all have a marketing guy at the front. And the geek, which I do for a living myself actually, is now just the person the technician. It's the infrastructure who puts the tellies in the bottling rooms and this kind of thing. So I think we should just debunk this myth completely that you can go into your bedroom, learn to write code and do something amazing to entrepreneur something. You can do lots of interesting things, but entrepreneurialism is building on some kind of infrastructure and making something out of it.
Okay.
I would agree with you there, and I think there's definitely, there's a lot of conversations these days about encouraging entrepreneurship for kids, for example. The vision of entrepreneurship that we're encouraging is the Zuckerbergs, it's the Steve Jobs, and not that these aren't amazing individuals who did amazing things, but I think we're doing entrepreneurship a bit of a disjustice if that's the only thing that we're saying is, defines an entrepreneur. Not only for the people who aren't, sitting in their bedrooms, writing code. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I encourage people to code. My organisation encourages people to code. But it's around sort of saying, okay, there are lots of different ways to be an entrepreneur, and actually entrepreneurship is tough. And why do you want to be an entrepreneur? And I think there's also this idea around people sort of going behind entrepreneurship, almost a cult of entrepreneurship, because people think that that's the only way that they can get either control or decision making within their jobs. And there's a question there for me around, do you really want to be an entrepreneur, or do you just want a more fulfilling job? Because actually creativity and innovation and growth can happen as easily in big companies as it can as an entrepreneur. I'm not saying that entrepreneurship doesn't have a place, because clearly so much of our innovation is driven by individuals who are just passionate about what they do. But I think we also need to temper that with the fact that people can be very happy working in companies, can be fulfilled working in companies as well.
Yeah, I think there's a really narrow conception of what a startup is in the public imagination. It's in Shoreditch, it's 20-somethings, it's geeks, and that's just a very, very constrained view. And if you talk about startups who have actually created new businesses, fracking was pioneered by startups. But people don't talk about that.
Yeah.
So there's lots and lots of entrepreneurial activity that's far more productive than the stuff that goes on in Shoreditch. Primarily, it seems to be around food delivery, kind of estate agents, and various ways of shopping online. And that's one of the things I really like about startups is that sense of autonomy and ambition and risk-taking, which you don't find in other parts of the economy and society. So I do like that, but that's relative to the cautiousness everywhere else. And I think there could be a lot more ambitious goals around startups. And there are some. I mean, there's two that won the awards recently, the London Innovators Awards. One was the What 3 Words business that's mapped the whole, given the whole world an address when 70% of the world hasn't got an address, with a really simple addressing system. And another company called Zap and Go that have created a graphene-based supercapacitor that can charge up your phone in 5 minutes and things. So that there are some ambitious things going on, but there's an awful lot of so-called meaningful work going on around what I would argue is pretty meaningless goals.
Yeah,
personally,
I would agree, and I think there's, as you just touched on as well, there's certainly a kind of cult, a kind of trend for entrepreneurship, startups, which has emerged in the last few years, really, certainly since I started running businesses 10 or 15 years ago, and there is a big question mark over whether or not starting a business, being an entrepreneur, is an end in itself, because for most startups, there's various statistics about this, but give or take, half of them are dead within 3 years. It's an immensely unstable way to run your life. You're not likely to have any kind of income kind of security, certainly in the initial years. Getting a mortgage is probably going to take you a little longer than someone with a job. And all in all, it's usually a very, very rough road for people doing it. And you may well get there in the end you may not. But I think this kind of notion that it is an end in itself and that everyone should be encouraged to start their own business and become the next Branson is completely absurd, actually. And instead, what people should look at is more realistic goals about, what do you want out of your life, and if you are going to start a business, what is it for, and what value can you add?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
It all feels rather positive at the moment, so just a slightly little twist on it.
Bring us down.
What's the difference between a ruthless, successful businessman or woman and an entrepreneur? Cecil Rhodes, Rockefeller, entrepreneurs, I guess, and very successful, very innovative, a great deal of change. But we look back now, very judgy. There are a lot of negative experiences. Certainly when I was a kid, you talked about aggressive, successful businessmen. Aggressiveness, ruthlessness was part of the successful hairdresser's chain, whereas if you were just a single hairdresser running your own little salon, presumably you've never had to be ruthless, aggressive, determined. The character of this is itself destructive. Often, if you're trying to grow a business, often you are trying to take market share. Now, there are examples where you are genuinely innovating and creating a product that previously didn't exist, but Google replaced Yellow Pages, and there were a lot of jobs associated with Yellow Pages. We can now say it's for the better, but very destructive experience if you're on the Yellow Pages side of things. Uber is, for some, an amazing thing, but extremely destructive to all sorts of people's livelihood, and not necessarily a good thing in itself, of the consolidating of all sorts of wealth and a new monopoly run out of California rather than run out of a whole number of different cities. So we're saying the feeling seems to be that entrepreneurial is good and entrepreneurs are good. I think a lot of entrepreneurs are completely ruthless individuals and will often, for their own personal benefit, their own wealth, go out and with the intention of destroy as much as create. What does the panel think?
Are entrepreneurs the future? Well, yes, possibly, but I was very struck by all of the comments actually, but particularly Amelie and Kevin. Kevin, when he was talking about ambition in different areas, and Amelie in terms of innovation and creativity. And often we hear these terms, but like the previous comment, these days ambition and aspiration and a ruthless pursuit of certain things are the most unfashionable terms. But I think that, we can glamorize and flatter entrepreneurship. I think it's a very important thing, and we should encourage it, and taking risks and adventure in an age where that's not particularly encouraged, even though people talk about tech startups. But I think we have to ask a question about the kind of overall climate that we're in. And the old idea was you either were for the state doing things with big infrastructure projects, or you believe just in the market resolving those things and entrepreneurs. But surely to improve the entrepreneurial spirit, the sense of adventure and possibilities for everyone, there's a responsibility of the state as well, is there not, in terms of big infrastructure projects, encouraging that kind of climate, working with business, because after all, businesses on their own, no matter how big they are, often can't embark on those types of things. If you look at China and some of the fast rail links or the roads in India or elsewhere, massive infrastructure projects often have to go hand in hand between the state and big companies and entrepreneurs. And surely that would encourage more ambition and would provide a better backdrop to that. And I would, just as a tag on at the end, I'd be interested to hear what George thinks about the climate for entrepreneurs in his particular arena, just in terms of how regulation impacts his work.
Great, thank you.
I just kind of wanted to challenge a little bit this sense of entrepreneurs as being greedy, avaricious people. Entrepreneurship is also a force for social mobility, and I will say, when I first came to this country and with the riots and everyone was fearful of feral teenagers rioting in the streets, I met a remarkable young teenager, a black teenage boy from South London, who after hundreds of CVs could not get a job from anyone, and instead of just letting himself just, disappear into some black hole, he found his family's village in Uganda, where a coffee growing community, created his own fair trade coffee company, and that's how he saved himself and is now employing many others in that business. And I think that's the kind of sort of spirit and support and opportunity that entrepreneurship can offer.
I was interested in the distinction between the opportunity and necessity. I work in publishing, and I don't actually see those. The digital climate is such that it's changing and disrupting so much of the traditional patterns that opportunity and necessity are actually one and the same thing. And actually, the culture of entrepreneurship, or the startup culture, is such that I have set up my own publishing company, and when I go in to speak to prospective clients or to prospective customers, I realize I am in a conversation in which I have to convince them that I am an entrepreneur of opportunity rather than an entrepreneur of necessity. And I think that one of the elements of the startup culture is increasingly these individuals, who are these sole traders, are going to be being compelled into a conversation or a language or a kind of discussion with prospective clients in which they must be that entrepreneur of opportunity. And I think that can both that is a fact, but also it can degrade the language of the entrepreneur of opportunity, that we see startups as everything's a startup now, and I the language of the entrepreneur is diffusing itself to the degree to which we are beginning to question what it actually means.
I was just wondering what the panel's ideas were about the mentality of get rich quick idea of being an entrepreneur as a young person, like the idea that you can take an app idea and sell it and make your millions, and what you thought that came in with the whole debate about, are entrepreneurs greedy, opportunity, and where that fitted in, and also risk-taking and actually having to live out being your own boss, being self-employed.
Lots of good questions there. So I haven't heard from the world of academia for a while.
Okay. So the first person was talking about almost this ruthlessness of the entrepreneur, and I guess there's somebody who I guess I know from these kind of almost Twitter groups, and he says, of course, entrepreneurs at one point, probably about 10-15 years ago, or still in the EU, were called small and medium-sized enterprises, and he doesn't like small and medium-sized enterprises, because he was saying, well, every time you say the word SME, the next word is lack. So that because small companies quite often need some support for their management. Entrepreneurship, though, or the word entrepreneurship, just does imply power. It is empowering to be an entrepreneur. Now, but then, now, are we talking about power over or power to? So is it about having power over somebody else, or is it having the power to create? Because having the power to create is very positive. But there is this thing called creative destruction. And we talked about I think there was somebody talking about the entrepreneur's challenge. And in a sense, we want entrepreneurs to challenge the existing status quo in an industry, because that is a thing that opens up new things. Okay, what else did people say? I'm sorry, I haven't got the list.
You don't have to go through all of them.
All of them. Okay, well, I'll stop.
Do you want to clarify anything about the opportunity necessity?
The opportunity necessity, yeah. I mean, that's a distinction really, because it was made because we looked at global entrepreneurship data, and what we found was that actually some countries had huge numbers of people who were starting to be self-employed, but they weren't starting to be self-employed because they had this great opportunity. They just needed to do this in order to work. And it's about why you're doing it, not necessarily that the opportunity is bad. But I know a necessity entrepreneur who does really well, and he makes something like he makes as much as my salary. He works 10 months a year. He could, if he wanted, employ somebody, but that wouldn't make him much more money. So he just does what he does, and he's very happy with it. He does 4 little sessions a day where he goes around to people's houses and he sorts out their cookers, and he's fine. So necessity is about why you're doing it, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're having a bad time.
Yeah, I'd like to address a couple of points on the floor. So the chap at the back rightly identified that I work in the licensed industries. I run a music festival and a venue, an event space, nightclub, for want of a better word. And in those industries, we have an immensely highly regulated kind of framework in which we can do our business. We're licensees, so we have to ongoing kind of responsibilities to local authorities, compliance. The climate in London, with real estate being as it is, and this sort of general climate, I think, about the nighttime industries is not necessarily supportive toward these type of businesses. And we often come up against wrangles with local authorities, licensing, late night hours, this kind of thing, because it's an immensely controversial business to be in when it comes to local authorities, local residents. One of the accusations that has been kind of aimed at us as an industry or as individual businesses, this notion of kind of greedy bar owners, greedy club owners, which I think is a little unfair, because most venues, the vast majority of venues in London, are run by small enterprises, essentially independent businesses. There are very few actually owned by chains these days. And the way I feel about it, this kind of being perhaps a microcosm for a wider climate, is that while there is a trend for startup businesses, for small businesses, for people to trade and to grow things and to start things, in the UK, certainly in recent years, there isn't necessarily the same trend. It isn't really matched by a similar fetish for wealth creation, for getting rich, right? And I mean, we don't do it for the good of, certainly don't do it for the good of our health, quite the opposite actually. There's a chap on the floor who said, well, people become entrepreneurs, people start businesses for personal gain, to create wealth for themselves. Well, I don't really see where the shame in that is. And I think that it's immensely unfashionable in this country, in this climate. While you can say, great, let's start a business, let's be a startup, it's not really fashionable to say, well, actually, we're just trying to make money for us. We're trying to create a business, employ people, generate wealth. I deal with a lot of guys in America, like, because I book talent in the US, and I'm on the phone a lot to American music managers and agents, people in New York, and they talk a lot about money. They talk about how's your business doing, how's my business doing, how many tickets did that act sell, how much money is that generating. They're really not ashamed of it. If anything, they celebrate wealth creation, and it does kind of bother me a little bit that we're hung up on this idea of startups and creating businesses, but seem almost a little ashamed. And there's a chap on the floor who seems to suggest that creating wealth for yourself is somehow shameful. And I wholly disagree. Let's be honest, like, people start businesses to make money.
So how many people in the audience are employed? How many people don't get paid for being employed? So everyone here who is employed by someone gets paid. They don't do it for free. You don't work for altruistic reasons because you're feeling nice that day. I think, just to echo that, I don't think we should feel ashamed of wanting to make money to make our lives better. That's not a bad thing. We all do that. And I think, going on to the first point around, this destructive side of entrepreneurialism, ambition, ruthless, vicious, determined, these are human characteristics. You can work for big companies and be vicious and mean and manipulative and do illegal things, just as you can be an entrepreneur and do those things. I think we need to kind of probably dislocate slightly the sort of moral sort of behaviours versus entrepreneurialism. And don't get me wrong, there are sort of elements of being an entrepreneur. You have to be, I guess, to a certain extent, a determined person. If you're going to run your business, you can't be, sitting at home watching TV all day, because unless that's your job and that's how you make money, that's not going to grow your business. So I think, we do need to be a little bit fair here. I don't know if I call myself an entrepreneur. I run a small company. I was hired as a CEO. I guess I do a lot of the things that an entrepreneur would do, or someone who started their own business. So I still have to worry about, how do we grow our business? How do we bring on people? Are we doing the right things as far as strategy? How do I find funding? All of those types of things. So I guess I would sort of say I engage in activities which an entrepreneur would do without having started the idea in the first place. The business I run is a social enterprise. We work with companies, we work with young women to try and increase the proportions of women in tech and entrepreneurship. We're doing that because we're saying that what is existing, the way that people are working, isn't fit for purpose. And I think going to that point around destruction and the Yellow Pages example, for example, if the Yellow Pages isn't fit for purpose for modern living, then why are we feeling bad about replacing it? There is no growth, there is no progression without the building and replacement of things which have come before us. The state versus the business angle was really interesting, and I think, unequivocally, I've largely worked in large corporates. I believe that there is a role for corporates, I believe that there is a role for the state, and you're right, there are some things which just can't get done, or very hard to get done by single persons. Not to say that there aren't entrepreneurs who go out there and kind of, create these huge, gigantic waves and manage to get everyone on board and all of that side of things. And it can be a huge positive aspect as part of social mobility as well. And, it's very empowering and allows people to sort of exercise how they want the world to look. If your world isn't the way that you want it to be, you can go and change it, you can go and build it, you can do something different with that. And then just to the last point around the sort of this really get quick kind of idea, there was a really interesting post I read recently, a guy called Mark Zuster, who's a serial entrepreneur himself. He's now a VC. He's got a post, it's really interesting, you should go read it. It's called Why I Effing Hate Unicorns and the Culture That They Create, or the Create That They Breed. And he basically starts off saying, something's rotten in tech startup land. Don't call me a hater for saying so. It's not that I'm anti-innovation or a disbeliever in disruption or calling it a full state bubble or saying every darn startup is going to fail. None of these. But I blame the unicorns. He's basically saying that he doesn't blame the companies themselves, but he says it's the idea that this sort of swashbuckling startups who define themselves by hitting some magical 1 billion valuation number and the financiers is backing, that actually we're forgetting the grit, we're forgetting the determination, we're forgetting the 50% of businesses failing. And most of those failures are for really boring reasons. Either you haven't got your financial model right, or the market's not correct, or you've had some sort of, issues with legislation or whatever that is. So it's not an easy thing to do. So I think, there's definitely a little bit of realism, which I think needs to come into the conversation.
The VC startup as well is a tiny proportion of businesses. VCs don't back most companies that start up. VCs are only involved in 3 or 4% of any startup at any time, and they are the particularly the ones that are attempting to grow to this big size, because you have to if you're going to have VC involved in your business. So you've kind of given up that choice about whether you're going to grow or not.
Yeah, just on the role of the state, that question at the back. Yeah, I think it's interesting. I'm kind of from the creative industries, and the buzz around startups now remind me of the buzz around the creative industries. When was it? 15, 20 years ago. And the way I always understood that buzz was that when New Labour came in, they jumped on that as some seeming area of, dynamic area of the economy. Even though it was an inconsequential area of the economy, they sort of used it as a bit of a veneer for economic dynamism. And I think there's a similar thing going on with startups. That there's been an explosion of startups over the last few years, and that's running parallel with completely flatlining of productivity growth.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem to have had any impact on the economy. And I think that the way I see it is that a big focus on startups is not an economic strategy. I think a healthy startup scene is part of a wider economic strategy, which involves the state funding early stage startups, funding infrastructure projects. For example, a lot of the Silicon Valley is built on technologies that was funded by DARPA, for example, one of the US institutions. And And, so at the moment, there's not enough real money going into that. Startups kind of play a useful role, that they keep the big corporates on their toes. Corporates sometimes, particularly in pharmaceuticals, outsource R&D to startups. Sometimes, very, very few, sometimes startups do create whole new industries. But I think it's part of a wider economic strategy. And at the moment, Apple and Cisco are spending more money on share buybacks than they are on R&D, and the state is spending sod all on R&D. So, I think that a focus on startups is not a strategy. It's a bit of a smokescreen.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Okay,
Thank you.
One question on the necessity question was, when you mentioned that, first of all, I initially didn't think about individuals as self-employed. I was thinking more about companies like GIF-GAF, Atom Bank, who are really creative, but who are responding to a necessity to develop their competitiveness. So that's an angle perhaps to think about. So and a second question was around, I work in housing, and my company builds homes that we want to build homes that people can afford to live in. And I'm thinking about to what extent startups or entrepreneurs are focused on big questions or questions of need that are a sort of social good from that perspective, as opposed to some of the more service sector, entrepreneurship, which gets great results in terms of ease of life, quality of life, the price you pay for things. But to what extent are we focused on the right things as we're entrepreneurs?
So that kind of raises an interesting thing about entrepreneurialism. Entrepreneurialism being a set of values and a kind of culture, and you could even say a corporate could be entrepreneurial if you wanted to stretch it, versus entrepreneurs, which are individual by definition. They're individual. So when you're talking about entrepreneurs, you're kind of asking, can we, to your point, can the economy be regenerated or change or be innovative based on individuals kind of doing it for themselves? Not saying which is right or wrong, but obviously the entrepreneurial aspect or entrepreneurialism being a kind of description of anything that could be kind of innovative or whatever, versus building on, from the ground up kind of thing, and whether, as you seem to be hinting at, whether that's a realistic proposition.
It's a question really on the extent to which the desire for wealth creation is a necessary element of being an entrepreneur, because I've noticed that among quite a lot of people, becoming an entrepreneur is actually viewed as a lifestyle choice and not necessarily something that is about the desire for great wealth, but more about a retreat from or about having more control over hours, being able to work less, and that sort of thing, and the horrible sort of mumtrepreneur phrase. And so I just wondered if you had any comments on that, because it seems to me that's quite a large element of the entrepreneurial culture is as a lifestyle choice.
Sure. Very good.
I couldn't help but think, and I'd love to hear what the panel thinks of this, a solution to, not a panacea, but a solution to a lot of the issues raised. Something I'm very interested in is the idea of a basic income. I don't know if people have heard of it, but it's this idea that unconditionally, universally payment to every single person living in a society, enough to live on, enough to be above the poverty line. I think the main thing holding back businesses from actually succeeding and from people even starting to become entrepreneurs, to become people who write their own script rather than acting in somebody else's script, that the main thing holding them back is having to work a really shitty job, basically. Like a job where you don't have control over your time, where you don't have control over your hours. You're living a life of precarity. And that's becoming, that sector's increasing. The amount of people that are working in secure labor is actually going down, I think. This, people with salaries, people in the old working class, I think that's going down now. That precariat is increasing. Also, so I think that would actually increase productivity. And I was just wondering, basically, if that was is that something that entrepreneurs really talk about? I mean, they don't really like the state, and they don't want to talk about ideas really like that. But in a way, that would actually reduce the power of the state, because if you give people money to have control over they have control over their own time, it wouldn't be means tested. So it'd be a huge amount of bureaucracy reduced, it would be a huge amount of expenditure of the government gone down that could be going to research and development. And then, just on a final, very small point, people who don't want to be ruthless, Machiavellian, get-rich-quick type people, and let's just face it, aside from all the rhetoric of social entrepreneurism, you have to make money to survive in this economy. This economy doesn't thrive on building solutions. It thrives on problems, trying to solve problems that most problems wouldn't exist, really, if it wasn't for money. Not having enough money. You know, most crime is to do with not having enough money. Most health problems, I mean, you mentioned health, most entrepreneurs have really, but they burn out by the time they're 30 years old, I think, most of them. I don't plan on becoming one anytime soon because of that. I've seen what it does to people and stress. Yeah. So, anyway, I'm just going to finish on that. People who don't want to be entrepreneurs, they can have the free time to do volunteer work and altruism and actually do something for society. Things like climate change. Entrepreneurs don't really care about that, generally speaking. So
great, thank you very much. Sorry.
I blame the unicorns. That's the phrase that I'll remember most from this panel, because I don't understand what that means at all. Is it a band that played at one of George's festivals?
Just to clarify, my apologies there. A unicorn is sort of 1 in a million companies which come out. So, you know, the Skypes might be a unicorn. So those startups which suddenly just grow really, really quickly and just outshine these sort of mythical creatures of startup world.
Right. Oh, well, I definitely want to be one of those. I went through this process earlier on this year of moving from an employed job to setting up my own business. I had some great training in that process by my employers. And the person who came in and trained me said, don't think of yourself as being a freelancer. That was a phrase that somebody used. What's the difference between a freelancer and an entrepreneur? His very practical point was that the tax office doesn't recognise the word freelancer. They recognise the phrase sole trader. So he said, as you make that process from being an employee to being a sole trader, think of yourself as being the managing director of your own little company. And I found that incredibly useful, because that triggered a bit of a mindset change, which has been valuable. And I think that could be valuable for anybody in whatever their entrepreneurial new role is, whether it's driving an Uber cab or a tech startup or doing what I do, which is to try to get people remembered when they take part in international meetings. All of that is to do with the mindset in the mind of the entrepreneur.
And the mindset being that you can control.
Yes, well, I can bring about a change which will be of great benefit to the people that I'm working for or with.
Great, thank you very much. And then the final word.
Sorry, I'm coming in for a second time. But I'm itching to say a number of things, because I think the bag of fallacies have been inflating rapidly, and I think there's a lot of incoherence in the debate, and I want to give you a clue how one might cut through this. So I'm coming from a libertarian perspective. I think the lady there is the one which I feel most sympathy with. So the first thing is to realize that money was one of the greatest invention of civilization, and the invention of markets and capitalism in the 18th, 19th century delivered us to this new world of opportunity and development and progress. And I think we need to, for instance, not so much worry about the precariat, and that things become more precarious on the one side means that we're more dynamic and growing and evolving faster, and that means we're all participating in this in one way or another. And if we want to put guarantees against that and stop this, because there's a lot of contradictory moments and assessments of competition. There's on the one hand the recognition that you have to allow some of it, at the same time you think of it as being destructive. Of course it involves adjustment to something better. And that's what we need to start to see. So we need to embrace that, and we need to not put a down on this entrepreneurial spirit. It's really something which thrives. And if you look at small and medium enterprise, that's where the growth of the economy is. That's where the growth of jobs is. And I think the new startup scene in London is super exciting, and we shouldn't second guess and judge whether it's for the good of society according to you. The money, the profit and loss system delivers that. Right? Because money you earn is just showing that you've made more people happy. They've been willing to give their hard-earned money to you first.
That's
and
a
money
great
is a
point to end
certificate
on.
of service.
Excuse
And
me.
getting rich means
point.
that doing more for others. I'll
No,
stop
can
here.
you
So
leave
if
it
you
there?
think along
Leave
this
it there.
route-
Leave it there, please. Leave it there. Thank you.
I'm happy to leave it there. I think it's
need
clear
5
enough.
minutes for everybody to sum up, but good points. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you everybody for your contributions. Very good. Go ahead.
Just to sum up, and in response to a point from the floor, of course, the dream of being an entrepreneur is the lifestyle. Just the fact that, the notion that you can control your own destiny, your own hours, your own bank balance, your own life in a way that someone who's one of those poor unfortunate employed people can't. Well, the reality is that that's often not the case, and that it can actually become quite an albatross. You know, it's actually something that will take over your life. And when it's going well, that's great, but on the rare occasions that it goes horribly wrong, then that's actually immensely painful for the individuals involved. And perhaps to qualify my comments about wealth creation earlier, the point is that businesses go well, businesses go badly. You need to make hay while the sun shines. And if the objective of the entrepreneur is to make money, more often than not, he or she are doing so in order to kind of create a cushion for yourself on the occasion when it doesn't go quite so well. So unfortunately, money it may well be an objective. It's not necessarily always the result, but unfortunately that's the nature of the beast.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, just picking up on the lifestyle choice. I think, yeah, there's something that we probably haven't talked that much about, is to the extent that there's a massive cultural shift has happened. And there was an interesting survey that I saw that I think across 27 countries, 18 to 30-year-olds were asked what they want to do with the future. And I think 2/3 of them wanted to be an entrepreneur. I mean, that is a massive cultural shift. And it's not just about young people wanting to bring their dog to work and drink artisanal coffee or whatever. It's also the corporations as well. So I actually consult to a lot of corporations, and they're obsessed with lean startups and the language of agility. You know, so it's this big cultural shift that's happened that goes beyond the economics.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you, Kevin.
Social good, CICs, community interest companies, mine's one of them. Check out, definitely, there's a lot of work going into the space of social enterprise, which I think is very positive. Wealth creation, yes, it is a lifestyle choice, but it's a lifestyle choice which is to earn enough money to live your life the way that you want to live. The point around money being the root of all evil, people are the root of all evil, unfortunately. It's, you know, what is it? There's a saying, isn't there? Guns don't kill people, people do. And it's true. It's sort of.
They do it with the guns.
They do it with the guns, but money is just a tool. It's how people use it, which is either good or bad or not moral or, you know, whatever. The universal income. I went to Cuba a few years ago, where they pretty much have a universal income as a standard. Most citizens earn around $15 a month. A doctor, you earn around $25. What I was surprised by was still within that, how much entrepreneurialism there is in that. People are desperate to kind of go beyond, and there is this thirst to just make things better, to have more for your kids, to be able to put them into, you know, better situations as adults. So I think if you try and have something which is too flat, you hold people back. You don't necessarily make them better as a whole. That's not to say there isn't income inequality, but I'm not sure if that's the perfect solution either.
Okay, thank you very much.
I was just going to say about entrepreneurship that really what we're doing with entrepreneurship is we're giving lots of people the chance to try and solve different things. So talking about the housing sort of issue you were concerned with, we ask MBAs and we ask people on courses for undergraduates to try and think of a business idea. And lots of the business ideas start with somebody saying, well, where is the pain and how can I solve it? And they come up with ideas around the environment, around solving particular problems. We've also tried with kind of health companies to say, well, can we encourage people to start businesses that solve a particular problem or that the health companies have got? So one of the health companies said, well, can you use it, if you like, can you use your students to solve a problem about diabetes? Can you create an app that will help people deal with diabetes? So entrepreneurship is a way, in a way, a bit like open innovation. It's a way in which you can get great ideas from everywhere. It's not quite everywhere, that's the ideal, but it's better, I guess, it's better distributed as wide as we can do it.
Great. If we could thank our speakers, thank you very much.